So when you want to play a walking bass line, how much are you thinking about what notes to play each time the chords change? Here's something you need to think about. Hi, I'm John Liebman, and welcome to another edition of The Essence of Groove. When you're playing a walking bass line, how do you decide what notes to play, not just within the chord, but today I want to talk to you about what to play when you transition from one chord to the next. For example, let's say we want to play a 2-5-1 walking line in C major. And so on. We're just playing three chords here: a D minor 7 chord, a G7 chord, and a C major 7 chord. So how do you keep that flow so it doesn't sound like you're playing, okay, we're doing the D minor, now we're doing the G7, now we're doing the C7. No, we want to flow. We want it to feel good. We want to provide that pulse. We want to make the groove happen. We want to have... I was doing a gig one time. It was on upright bass. It was down in Miami outside at some fancy house at a pool party in the back. It was nighttime. And I'm playing along on the upright, and the guitarist was taking a solo. And he turned around. He interrupted his own solo and turned around to me and said, "John, that feels great, what you're doing." I guess it was worth interrupting his solo. I wasn't even going to tell you that. It just popped into my head this second. Anyway, my teacher, one of my teachers years ago, before I even went to Miami, this was in the 80s, and the guy's name was Dan Plisco. No longer with us, unfortunately. He was not the classical double bass teacher that I sometimes talk about. This was the jazz guy. And he taught me something about playing a walking bass line that I have never forgotten, and I use it to this day, probably 99% of the time, maybe even 100% of the time. What he told me was, when the chords change, when you're playing a walking line, now listen carefully, this might sound a little confusing, but it really isn't. Change the interval of the notes from one chord to the next by either a second, a fourth, or a fifth. Again, it's not complicated. Look, if we're playing our D minor 7 chord, for example, actually let's do, and then we want to go to a G7 chord like we said, and then the C chord. So notice the last note of the D minor bar is an A, and the first note of our G7 chord is a G. So the interval between the last note of the D minor bar and the first note of the G7 bar is an interval of a second. And we keep going. The G7 bar was like this. Oops. And the interval between the last note of the G7 chord and the first note of the C chord is also an interval of a second. So again, the D minor chord, here's a major second, and then the G chord to the C. So each time we change chords, each time the music changes from one chord to another, our walking bass line moved by an interval of a major second. Major second just means the distance of 2 frets in either direction. A minor second is the distance of 1 fret in either direction. In our example, we did it with a major second. So once again, and going back to the D, I also played a major second, an E to a D. So that's one. You can fool around with minor seconds too, but I just want to keep it simple and give you the general rule for this lesson. I said a second or a fourth or a fifth. So let's do the same thing, only let's make that interval a fourth. So here's our D minor chord. Notice instead of going, I went back to the D. Now the distance between our D and our next chord, which is a G, is an interval of a perfect fourth. You know that interval? Here comes the bride. That's a perfect fourth. Did the same thing there. Here comes the bride. So we went, here's our G chord to our C chord. And then again, the fifth. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. There's our perfect fourth. Back to the D where we start the cycle all over again. So far we did 2 examples. One with a major second. Again, we're talking about the interval on our walking bass line between the last note of one chord and the first note of the next chord. And we said we're going to make that interval either a second, a fourth, or a fifth. And we did 2 examples so far, one with a second, and we did one with the fourth. Oops. And the third example, the third thing he told me was use a perfect fifth. Actually, it doesn't technically have to be a perfect fifth, but again, that's advanced stuff that we're not going to get into. Let's just say a fifth. So, what I meant to play. So there's our perfect fifth. Flintstones, meet the Flintstones. That's how you remember a perfect fifth. Flintstones. Each time we went with an interval of a perfect fifth going down. So that is a general rule that would be good for you to adhere to, rather than just, like I said before, playing the D minor, now I'm playing the G7, now I'm playing the C, and all I got to think about is, okay, I got to play a D on the first note of the bar, I got to play a G on the first note of the bar, I got to play a C on the first note of the bar, which is not technically necessarily true every time, but this is about a flow, and this is a way to make that flow happen. So okay, on and on. I don't even think about it. I just do it naturally when we're changing from one chord to another in a walking bass line. Make the last note of one chord and the first note of the next chord separated by an interval of some kind of second, some kind of fourth, and some kind of fifth. And like I said, you can fool around with minor seconds. You have to be careful though, and augmented fourths, diminished fifths, etc. But try this. Major second, perfect fourth, perfect fifth. Give it a try. See how that adds some flow and some fluidity to your walking bass lines. And let me know how you make out. As you know, I'd love to hear from you. I read the comments. I respond to all the comments. Really like to know your takeaway. And let me know what else you'd like to learn. I do this every week. I've got all kinds of tips and advice for learning bass. And if you're not yet subscribed to this channel, take care of that right now. Subscribe to the ForBassPlayersOnly YouTube channel so you don't miss anything, including next week's lesson, where I will see you right back here, same time, same place next week, with another edition of The Essence of Groove right here at ForBassPlayersOnly.com. In the meantime, I'm John Liebman. Let's play bass.